This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzanotes, and today is Saturday, and that means it's time for Nizzanotes, my weekly vlog series where I talk about limited magic. We're in the early stages of the Brothers War Limited, but there are already 10 cards that I know I was wrong about in my set review. I'm going to talk about those 10 cards in this video, which will also sort of give you an update on how I'm thinking about this format, and we'll of course also do a crack-a-pack at the end of the video. First up, let's talk about Goblin Blast Runner. Chances are, if you've been playing this format a fair bit, you've seen just how good this card has been. In general, right now at least, I feel like the Black-Red Sacrifice deck is the top deck in the format. And it just turns out there's lots and lots of ways to sacrifice things for free or cheaply. One really important thing about the Blast Runner is it's any permanent, so even Evolving Wilds suddenly gets a pretty big upgrade in your deck if you have a few Blast Runners. These aggressive red-black decks can just sort of curve out, sacrifice stuff to do extra damage, and suddenly you're dead before you can really get your feet underneath you, and the menace on Goblin Blast Runner is a huge part of what allows those decks to do so much damage early, so quickly. So it's a card I underrated. I think most people, when they see this card, wouldn't think it was going to be that good in a limited format. But at the same time, it seems like almost every one drop we get these days is pretty good. You're just paying so little for something that it doesn't have to do that much to feel incredible, and the Blast Runner definitely does enough to be a pretty good card. Obviously, you need to have it in the right deck. If you're not in Black-Red, you have basically no interest in running it, though sometimes you end up with some cheap sacrifice outlets in other red decks, and then it gets to be kind of okay too, really, but it's really at its best in the Black-Red Sacrifice deck. There's just plenty of common sacrifice outlets and lots of sacrifice fodder in the format. On the flip side of things, Suchi Caveguard is a card I was pretty excited about going into the format, and it turns out it's just not very good. Ramp is a thing in the format, but I have gradually, over the first, couple dozen drafts I've done, come down a little more on these ramp decks more and more, mostly because aggro decks in the format can be so formidable, like, the Goblin Blast Runner, sacrifice decks. But red, white, blue, white, black, white, these are all really nice aggro decks. And that makes ramp strategies worse. But what's really bad about Suchi compared to like some other stuff in the format is all the other stuff that you can ramp into that, does a pretty good job of winning you the game when you ramp into it, has prototype. So you can cast these things early if you really need to shore up your defenses to not die. You can't do that with Suchi. You have to ramp up to 8 mana. You got to get there. And doing that, having a card that only does that is a problem. I don't think it's completely unplayable. If you have a pretty good ramp deck, sure, you can play it. But I feel like most of the time you'd rather have cards like the 5 mana 3/5 Reach that can also be a 10 mana 10/10 Trampler. Sure, it isn't as good as Suchi in a lot of ways, like in a vacuum, but the flexibility between the new options is really important, and Suchi doesn't do that. Another disappointing card that is bad as a result of this format being fairly aggressive is Disciples of Gixx. I wasn't super high on this in the review or anything, but I sort of convinced myself that you'd be able to pay 6 for this, cast your 4/4, and get like a card and a half worth of value out of searching up 3 artifacts. And you kind of can, but the fact that this is a 6 mana 4/4, getting to that mana, first of all, like that's a significant amount of mana, first of all. And second of all, it doesn't add anything that scary or relevant to the board for a while. So it's really not the kind of thing you want to be doing with your 6 mana in the format. It's pretty much unplayable. I've talked before, in last week's video, I talked about how the whole cycle of self-mill commons are pretty nice. And there's one in particular that I underrated significantly for some reason in my set review. The others, I think I was roughly correct about. But the Gigamole is the one where I think I was just completely wrong. I thought it would be fine. And I'm not really sure how I got there. I mentioned that you'd hit a card with it a lot of the time. And you do. And that's the thing. It's a 2-for-1 a lot of the time. It feels like a better Gravedigger because it has better stats a lot of the time. And Gravedigger is a great card. It's not a perfect comparison, obviously, because Gravedigger can get any creature out of your graveyard. You have to mill the right thing with the Gigamole to get it back. But most decks have so many creatures in them that you're going to get a 2-for-1 with it. It's going to be the kind of thing that you do want to be doing with your mana because you get to add to the board a reasonably relevant body. And then, you get a 2-for-1 in the long run. Black is also interested in putting things in the graveyard, and this is a way better way to do it than Disciples of Gixx. Scrapwork Mutt is next. This has been just one of the best commons in the set. It's one of these cards that just does all sorts of little things that lots of decks in the format are interested in, and it just makes it so it's sort of the glue that holds the set together, at least a lot of the red decks. I didn't think it was going to be bad, but I didn't think it was going to be this either. This card where in almost every red deck, you'd be pretty happy if you had like 4 of them in your 2-drop slot. So what makes it so good? I mean, first of all, it's a decent 2-drop for the aggro decks. Unearth is also not a bad thing to have around in the aggro decks because it sort of gives your creature a second chance to do damage. But then the fact that you can also use it to sift through your deck to load your graveyard is important. For the sacrifice deck, you can not only bring it back to do more damage, you can sacrifice it for more value. It digs you deeper into your deck. It just does a lot of little things that are worth way more than the 2 mana you spend initially for it. And then bringing it back the second time, you still feel like you're getting a pretty good deal. It's just been a really good common. On a similar note, Scrapwork Cohort has been too. This one I was higher on in the set review than the Mutt, but it's still even better than I expected. It's also one of the best commons in the set. If you're in white, it's great that you can unearth it, but even in decks that don't have white, like the Sacrifice deck, likes this card because it gives you 2 bodies to sacrifice for value. Obviously, you want to be able to unearth it because in the end you end up with 3 bodies and, sort of a 4th one that is only around for a turn, but hey. So you end up just being able to get a lot of stuff back out of this card. It just gives you more than a card worth of value most of the time. It's got good synergy for going wide. It's good with the soldier stuff. Sort of like Scrapwork Mutt, it just sort of crosses over into a lot of different decks in the format. Next, there's a retro frame artifact card, and that is Swiftfoot Boots. I tried my best not to overrate this in the set review because, this is a card that if you've played Commander or whatever, you have so many good memories of putting this on your Commander and just winning the game. And, thinking of that upside is sort of what got into my head, and I ended up overrating it, I think, significantly. It's interesting if you go back and watch the set review when I talk about the boots. There are lots of people who told me I was an idiot and that it was a bomb, and it's like, it's not. And in the video, I mentioned the problem with Swiftfoot Boots in the original review. I said, you need your creature to already be good, or it doesn't really matter that you put this on it. And that is key. But it's even more of a problem than I expected it to be. There's just not a deck in this format that wants this, for the most part. I don't think it's entirely unplayable. I think it's kind of a build-around where if you have enough creatures bombs or creatures who, if they stay in play, your opponent just can't win, running it's not a bad idea. But most decks just don't have that. And the problem is, the aggro decks don't want this. They want to be playing creatures. Yes, it can grant haste and stuff like that, but you'd much rather just play another creature than Swiftfoot Boots basically on every turn. You want to play a creature or a removal spell or a combat trick. This is none of them. So it just doesn't fit in those decks. The decks I thought it might fit in are the ramp decks where you ramp into some big thing and you put this on it. And, it is obviously better there usually than it's going to be in an aggro deck. But it's still, hard to have the right targets for it. A lot of the really big creatures are hard to remove anyway that you want to ramp into. So it ends up not having a whole lot of homes. I thought it was going to be pretty good, a card you'd want to value relatively highly in the right deck. But for the most part, you just end up not playing them at all. A lot of times it just feels like you're mulliganing because it just doesn't do enough to be a full card's worth of value. That requirement that your creature already has to be crucial and important, like a commander is in your commander deck, just doesn't line up often enough for a card that grants no significant stats boost. Another one is Iron Craw Crusher. So this one is one I was wrong about because I didn't read the card carefully. So this one's not exactly one where it's been better than I expected because of stuff in the format. But when I did the review for this card, I thought it could only buff other creatures. Turns out it can buff itself too, making it a pretty formidable attacker all on its own, both as a prototype and as a regular creature. So, it's a significantly better thing to have around, especially, like, I've been pretty happy with casting the prototype version. That just ends up being a problem on a whole lot of boards in general. One other retro frame artifact card I want to mention is Burnished Heart. Early in the format, I was sort of singing this card's praises because it's like the best source of fixing in the format, and that's true, but it seems like it's better in this format to just abandon trying to play 3 colors for the most part. Maybe you splash, because what you want is you need a deck to be fairly functional, without a splash or anything else going on. Because even if you're one of these ramp decks, you need to be playing things in the early going that have more of a presence on the board, and this just doesn't have it. It's hard to find the time to cast it and then use its ability. I don't think it's bad. I'm just saying early in the format, I was like, yeah, this thing's awesome because it fixes for you, and it does. But, you'll play it in your ramp decks, and it's nice in them. But you shouldn't go after it that highly, I don't think. And then the last card, and this is the one that might surprise me the most, is Levitating Statue. We've seen cards like this a lot. Stuffed Bear is kind of an example. This is better than that, and I knew that going into the set. I gave an F to Stuffed Bear back in the day, and I gave this like a D+. But it's a lot better than a D+, and there's a few reasons for it. First of all, the whole non-creature spell thing, there's just a lot of good ones in the format. They're all over the place. Turns out, letting this sit around on the board and gain counters and then eventually animating it and attacking your opponent is great. But what makes it truly good, in the right deck is Might Stone's animation. Weak Stone's animation? It'll be on the screen. The card that turns your artifact into a 4/4. Like, that card you play in all those decks anyway. You play it in a lot of decks in the format. It's just a good card. It's one of Blue's best commons. But putting it on your Levitating Statue is just it's going to be like a combo we look back on in this format when we think about the format. And, this is going to be one of the defining things you think of because it's just so powerful. You get a couple counters on it, you play the animation, and you have this very problematic creature, sometimes as early as like turn 5, and it puts you on a quick clock. If you can't deal with it, you're going to die. And so it's both the fact that it's easier to get counters on it, it's easier to animate by paying the mana than I expected, and having a blue common in the format that you already want to play in most of your decks in the format, certainly in the spell decks in the format, that is an amazing combo with it. All of that has made it a lot better. Again, this isn't a card you want in every deck. There's lots of decks you don't want it in. If you're a more traditional aggro deck, you really don't want this. But if you're like the blue-red tempo deck, that's like an amazing spot for this. Some of the blue-black decks, it's an amazing card in. But yeah, it's just been way better than I expected, obviously, since it's on this video. All right, so those are the 10 cards I got wrong. Hopefully, all of that helps you do a little better in the format. Let's do a crack-a-pack now, where, as usual, I'll show you a pack. I'll talk about each card in it, tell you what I would first pick. All right, so our retro frame artifact is actually Burnished Heart, that card we were just talking about. Card going into the format I thought you might want to first pick sometimes because the ramp and fixing it provides is real. But it turns out those things are a little less good in this format than I expected because there are enough assertive aggro decks that you have to go about ramping and stuff like that in a different way where you're adding more meaningfully to the board. It's something you can take for sure, but it's not something I want to first pick. Raise to the Ground is next. This thing's fine. It's like a one of in your red decks. I find myself cutting it more often than playing it, even in a set with this many artifacts, so it's really nothing special. Tocasia's Dig Site, haven't really seen this be worth it in decks. It does enough damage to your mana base, and the thing it does isn't that powerful, so you usually don't run it. Sibling Rivalry is next, so this is a card that, going into the set review, I did get this sacrifice build-around type thing right, and that's not that surprising. We've seen this card a lot. It's always good in decks where you can sacrifice things for free. It's especially good if you combine it with the 3 mana 3/2 who when it attacks sacrifices something and gains flying, because that gives you a free way to sacrifice the thing you steal from your opponent. It's really only good in that deck though, so I don't like the idea of first picking it. Right now I am on Burnished Heart out of these cards. Gixx's Caress is next. This card's interesting. I'm not sure how I feel about it right now. On 17 Lands, 17lands.com, you should check it out if you want to see some data about the format. It has a surprisingly high win percentage for a card that is a coercion effect, which we see these all the time, and they're almost never good. But in this format, it seems like maybe adding a Power Stone is enough of an upgrade to this kind of effect that it's good. I haven't really had it cast against me or cast it myself and ever felt that excited or sad about it. So I still don't like the card personally. I have a hard time understanding how it could be good, but maybe it is, then that's something to still learn in the format. For now, we're still on Burnished Heart. We have Goblin Blast Runner now, card we just talked about. It's a great one drop in the Sacrifice deck. It can end games in a hurry. I don't love the idea of first picking it either. It's good, but it's the kind of card where maybe it pulls you into the Sacrifice deck if you've already got some red or black cards. But I don't think you first pick it and force that deck, because if it's not open, you're in trouble. So I think we're still on the Heart. Yodian Medic is next. This thing has been okay, especially if you can buff soldiers and stuff, it's not a bad thing to do that with. The soldier deck is kind of a skies deck, and this is something you can have on the ground to lock down the ground while you attack in the air. It's fine. Still think we're on the Heart, though. Hoarding Recluse, another fine but unexciting card. It has passable stats, trades with anything, and it has an effect that comes up sometimes, whether you take away an unearthed card from your opponent or put something back in your deck that you didn't want to mill or something. But I think I would still take the Heart. Next up, though, we finally have a common that is better than everything else, and that is Wing Commando. This is really good in a lot of different decks. It works well in the Soldier deck and the Blue-Red deck especially, both sort of aggressive decks. One cares about soldiers, one cares about prowess triggers, so it fits great in both of them, and you'll play it in almost any blue deck and have it be solid or better. So it's what we would take now. Moment of Defiance, this has been a solid trick. It gets especially silly if you have any effects in play that let you trigger something when you draw a card. I've cast this before when I had two Gurgling Anointers in play, and that was completely absurd. It's just a nice card to have in that deck. It's an okay trick in all the aggressive black decks. The fact it replaces itself's a big deal. Still on Wing Commando, though. We move to the uncommons now. We've got Defabricate. This is mostly a sideboard card, even in a format with this many artifacts. You just don't have enough targets or ways to use this for it to feel like it's worth a card, so you don't want it. Recruitment Officer's next. This is a nice one-drop. Aggro's good in the format, and this is a one-drop that is very strong. In the early game, it is a Savannah Lions. And then in the later stage of the game, if you're flooding out, it can help you get out of that by finding you actual cards, which is nice. I still like Wing Commando more than Recruitment Officer, though. I think I would be in on the Wing Commando first. Dreams of Steel and Oil. So this is a discard effect I do like. Gixx's Caress is one I have a hard time getting behind. But Dreams of Steel and Oil only costs 1, and a lot of the time when you cast it, you don't quite get a 2-for-1, but you get more than a card worth of value, because you get a card out of your opponent's hand, and then you exile something with Unearth from their graveyard or whatever. And that feels pretty good. That said, it's just an okay card. Our uncommons in this pack are pretty underwhelming. Recruitment Officer is the only one that I'm interested in. The other two, I think one's a sideboard card, the other's your 22nd or 23rd card in your deck. I think I'm still on Wing Commando here. I think it's the best card in the pack. It's a common. What's our rare? It's also bad. It's the Stasis Coffin. It has a cool effect. Protection from everything's exciting, but it's basically a glorified fog. Fogs aren't good in limited. They never are. They never will be. I mean, I shouldn't say that. Who knows? There might be some weird mechanic someday where for every damage you prevent, something happens in some set. So maybe they'll be good someday. But so far, they haven't been good. And this is just because, using a card to not affect the board and only delay the inevitable is rarely worth it. And every time I talk about fog, someone in the comments is like, well, what about if your opponent alpha strikes and then you cast the fog and then you swing back at them? And it's like, yes, that's the one situation where it's good. But that situation doesn't actually happen that often. And you'd rather have a card that's more impactful in a broader number of situations than one that's only good in one rare situation. So pretty weak pack overall. I think a lot of our Cracker packs have been weirdly. I think it goes Wing Commando, Recruitment Officer, Burnished Heart. So even though I was mean to Burnished Heart in the first part of this video, I think it's the third best card in this particular pack. I do think there's, Sibling Rivalry and Goblin Blast Runner both have much higher ceilings than the Heart does. But if you don't end up in that deck, they're both substantially worse. So I'm less interested in taking them here than I would be like, if this was pack 2, pick 1, and I already had a bunch of good sacrifice stuff going on, things would be different. But this is pack 1, pick 1, and I would take Wing Commando. All right, so that does it for this edition of Nizzanotes. I think next week's video will probably be the one where I sort of walk you through each of the archetypes, ranking them, but also telling you like the key common in each of them and stuff like that. We got a sense of some of that today, especially as far as the black-red deck goes. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos in this series and a whole bunch of other Magic content, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to look at draft videos of this format that I've put up on the channel or other videos in this particular series, you should see the playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.